pandemic started. We've been open. Yes, good, I like that. Without further ado, we'll introduce Matthew Borgen.
My name is Matthew Borgen. I am originally from northeastern Ohio. That's where I grew up. That's where I went to art school at the University of Akron. I moved on to Chicago for a year, and then I went and lived in Minneapolis for 3 years, and that's where I did my master's in drawing and painting. After Minneapolis, I needed some more East Coast. I needed to go someplace where people were a little more direct, because I tend to be a little direct, and so I don't feel like I always fit in Minneapolis that well. So I've been in Philly since 2002, so I've been living and working here for about 20 years. The work I'm showing in James's space, and again, thank you for the opportunity to show here, I really appreciate it. This has been a great experience. Is the sort of more recent pieces from a sort of a body of work that's been going on for about 5 years or so, dealing with sort of mid-century comic books. As a kid, growing up, my mother still has the pictures that I used to draw, Batman and Robin. That's always been where I'm comfortable, where I'm happy. I didn't like drawing arms then. Most of those characters from that era didn't have arms, so I added arms later on in my career. I finally figured that part out. But I collected comics all throughout my childhood, teenage years, into my mid-20s. And I was always particularly drawn to comic books that predated my birth. For some reason, I was always more interested in the characters from the 30s and 40s than I was in the comic books that were sort of being made, at that sort of present moment. So there was some sort of nostalgic quality about it that I found appealing, that I actually find it really hard to articulate why. Like, it's kind of comforting, but sort of dark and distant all at the same time. And I think it's part of why I use the imagery, because I'm trying to figure out what do I find compelling about it. Like, what is it that, I think when you're making art, you're like always trying to put your finger on why this is interesting to me. And you can spend 20 or 30 years trying to figure out why something's interesting to you. So maybe to talk a little bit about this process, and this is a way I started working maybe about 5 years ago, which is to take sort of appropriated images from comic books that already exist. Most of the comic books that were generated during the mid-20th century, and there were just millions of different books that were created at that time, are all in the public domain at this point. Some of the bigger heroes are still sort of owned by the bigger companies, but most of what was made has just sort of gone, just dropped into public use. And most of those comic books are free and available to look at online digitally. So there are several sites that just are databases of these old books. So you can go through them, and and that's what I started doing. I just started going through hundreds of old comic books, and I would just grab images that I found compelling or interesting. I would start to see, if I started to see a pattern, I would start to collect sort of a morgue of images. So if, like the piece over here, for example, and we'll probably move around and stuff, so hopefully everybody's okay with that. But just like a piece like this, like the gardener, a lot of this just happened in a day where I was just going through a series of books and kept coming across airplanes crashing, burning airplanes crashing. It was like one day where I found just like 6 of them. I don't know why, maybe that publisher was just really interested in crashing planes, I don't know. But you start to see, when you go through them very quickly, you start to see patterns, and they become the cliches or the conventions of that genre. In terms of the process, these are all made digitally. They start in Photoshop, so you're just cutting out images from these downloaded pages, and you start playing around with them. You start adding things, taking things away, and once you get a composition that I'm generally happy with, those pieces end up going into my iPad, and I use a program called Procreate, and I essentially redraw all the imagery. Primarily because the files are so small that you really couldn't get them to the scale without sort of having them degrade. But also I do change them a lot. They do end up, sometimes it's like, well, I really need that guy to have an arm, so then you have to add the arm. So they all do get essentially redrawn. Then they go back into Photoshop, and that's where color gets added, any kind of effects. We were talking earlier about, you'll notice that there's a kind of halftone pixelation that's happening that is definitely meant to be a close approximation of the old halftones that you would see in the publishing style of those older books. So it's meant to evoke a kind of another era, like a more nostalgic era. So that's a little bit about sort of how these are made. It's a good question. As close as I can be to the authentic original, because there's something about that was compelling to begin with. So I am definitely trying to emulate that style. So I'm definitely not trying to make it mine, if that makes sense. I want it to feel like it came from that era, and so I do try to imitate that as much as possible. It's not always possible to get it exactly. The only time I really alter things is if something different is required for the composition. So sometimes you have a character that's in a small panel, like this is maybe this piece over here with this kind of Arthurian legend piece. It's actually very rare if you think about it, especially from comic books of that era, to have like full-bodied individuals. But in this instance, I was actually emulating a painter named Larry Day, who just had a show up at the Woodmere. He was a really well-known Philadelphia painter back in the 60s, 70s, or 80s. But he was evoking like Renaissance era, where you have the sort of the full-scale, full-scale bodies in space. And so you might only have, like this guy, for example, was actually made by 3 different parts of him from 3 different pages. So he had to be merged together to get him like standing in that particular way. The original images are always going to be sort of subservient to an idea. But in order for that idea to come through, it has to feel a little bit like it came from that other time. And so there's definitely not I actually like to try to avoid my hand feeling like these were involved at all, which I think is why the digital execution is important. Like it feels like it was published. It feels like it was mass-produced almost, if that makes sense. Like I say, in an image like this, I think I found an old 1950s mid-century modern living room that I then manipulated quite a bit. And then you're going through, this was definitely a piece where I went through old pages with more of an agenda, like looking for something specific. You can easily go through the old pages and old materials and just see if something strikes you, see if something's compelling to you. And, or like again, if you notice patterns, you just start to collect groupings of these things. I think with this piece I had actually come across a comic book that was trying to depict the sword and the stone, the Arthurian legend of Arthur ascending to be king, and actually found this guy. And it started to develop into, I was working on a piece that was totally different from this. It was actually a piece that was meant to sort of elicit like a stereotypical 1950s suburb. And in my head, like each of like the husbands of these sort of nuclear families was out in front of his house, and each one of them had a rock in their front yard, and there was a sword sticking out of it, and they were all spending the weekend trying to get the sword out as if they were like sort of clearing something. This one obviously has more of the feeling of a narrative, but it's different from like a comic narrative, for example, because we're not seeing a sequence. We're sort of, this is more of like maybe a Renaissance era sort of vignette of something happening. The other thing that's really compelling, or what sort of drives these pieces, is just the notion of sequential art as a sort of unique storytelling device. I mean, we're accustomed, I think, to watching TVs and movies where we really are seeing image cut away to another image, cut away to another image, and we're very used to that as a kind of narrative storytelling technique. But when we're talking about comic books and sequential art, actually the piece behind you is a really good example of where we have this expectation that we tend to read mostly left to right. One thing happens after another, and there's this sort of trust of the author that we assume they're going to take us someplace that makes sense. We're going to go here, and then we're going to go here, and then we're going to go here. What started to occur to me, thinking about these as more as works of art and thinking about the more formal structures of sequential art, was that I didn't have those constrictions. Like, I didn't have to, like, it wouldn't be good to trust me as the narrator. I could kind of take these wherever I want.
It sets up a kind of tension.
Exactly.
Right?
Like, you could go, like, between the panel and what's called the gutter in comic books, so between that white space, anything could happen. You could go anywhere. Absolutely anything could happen. You could go 10,000 years into the future. You could, all of a sudden, you could be in Hawaii. Like, where does this trust of the narrator come from? So this, for example, is a piece where these are three just elements. And again, this was like, I find a lot of women in red dresses. Like, women in the 40s, 50s, they were always depicted in red dresses, and they're almost always blonde. So these are not hard to find. But as I was just gathering them up, I noticed this just sort of formal arc of the movement or the gesture. So really what's happening in this piece, she's sort of moving. If we were thinking like a traditional narrative, we see her moving to the left, although the expectation is that she would move to the right. So I liked where this set up the possibility that she could just be going this way. I mean, I don't know why she'd go from a fireplace to jumping into bed and falling asleep, but again, as the narrator, I could say that that's what happened. But theoretically, she could also be in the bed, she could be dreaming, and all of this is sort of like a dream. And so I sort of dream in comic book formats at this point, probably. I mean, there's probably a good reason for that. But I think we all sort of dream in these sort of vignettes where these sort of things happen and then we move away to another thing. And what's nice about sequential art is that you see all those things simultaneously, because I think that's how we tend to experience dreams as well. Like, we sort of, when we're trying to describe a dream to somebody, it's just like layer on layer of all these things, and it's hard to sort of, it's hard to articulate. But another maybe good example is the bullet trajectory piece. So here's so instead of taking the traditional left to right approach, if I'm going to put these on the wall, I actually don't really have to follow any narrative thread. So early on in my process, found lots of images of people shooting guns off panel. And I always thought about, like, where's that bullet going? And so I ended up creating these spaces where all the bullets converge. So there is no left to right narrative here. A story is implied, like I think you said the word implication, which I think that's implied here, but really what's happening. And again, what makes comic books unique, again, if we're watching a movie, we're cutting from image to image, but we only see one at a time. So we only see the previous image in our memory, and we can kind of anticipate what we're seeing next. But with comic books, you're moving from point to point, but you actually see them all simultaneously. So you can kind of see what's about to happen, and you're seeing all those things at the same time, which really makes it a really unique structure. And for pieces like this, like a lot of the pieces in this show are from a series that I refer to as, I'm going to blank on the name of Through the Mirror, I think is the name of the title, or the name of the series. But they're pieces about self-realization or self-analysis. And so they tend to evoke a dream a dreamscape. You know, the idea that these three characters could be wandering through the jungle and they would just encounter mirrors. So it's meant to have a dreamlike quality in that respect. And the context of it being from comic books means that we have the expectation that anything could happen anyway, so it's not that weird. Like a monster could show up, you know, J. Edgar Hoover could show up. It kind of doesn't matter, you know, anything could happen. And so if we think about the mirror as a place that where we analyze ourselves, or that we think about ourselves, I mean, that's what's happening. You know, again, this could be a literal moment, but it also occurred to me, and I should say, you know, these folks were just we're in the panel the way I found them. This has actually not changed that much, except that there was this, you know, awful racist caricature of Japanese soldiers, which you find in those comics quite a bit. Instead of them encountering this sort of racist trope, they're forced to look at these mirrors and they're forced to actually consider themselves and like sort of become aware, which was sort of happening as I'm looking through these images too. But there was almost like a breakdown of them as like the Freudian, you know, the Freudian ego, superego, id, in a way. And I think the only thing I added, like I think he had grenades, but I actually needed to make the grenades look more realistic. I think that's the only thing. So I took out the racist caricatures, I put mirrors in, and so all of a sudden, again, they could be in a space, but they're also, this could very much be like a dream state. Yeah?
Is there a reason why they're not seeing themselves in the mirrors?
I could probably make up a really fancy reason. I think it would look weird for me. It would be hard to draw. But like I said, maybe the more formal answer is we can all see ourselves. If we see one reflection, then there's no time for, we can see ourselves in these mirrors, right? That sounds like a better answer, so we'll go with that one.
Themselves oddly, because those are like those circus type mirrors, you know?
They are. And specific, yeah, so there's a distortion that implies happening too. But yeah, sometimes I just like, I do have pieces with mirrors where the person does see themselves, but sometimes it is nice when it's just, we get the opportunity to jump into it. This is a rarity in my practice. This is actually a panel that I just took straight from the book, didn't alter it, didn't do anything differently. It just struck, as I saw it, just struck me as something very odd and that there was more going on than maybe the original artist had intended. It's from a romance comic book. And again, I was doing all these pieces that were about sort of self-realization or self-analysis or dream analysis. And so this idea that this gentleman just encounters this woman, they're in an embrace and kissing, and he just states, "You're a dream." But clearly he's trying to be complimentary, or he's trying to tell her how amazing she is. But it struck me as that moment where, I don't know if you guys have had this experience where like you're in the middle of a dream and all of a sudden you have like a moment of lucidity and you're like, oh, I'm dreaming. And so I just thought of this as a moment in the dream where it just stopped. And it's kind of like, he's like, oh, I'm kissing this beautiful woman. Oh, this is probably a dream. It's probably not real. So I loved, and again, for us as the viewer, we could just be encountering an intimate moment, but I tend to think of this as this person being in their own head and realizing something about themselves. This is a more recent piece. This is from a series that I'm just referring to as White Men. Through all these works, because of the source material, because of the content, I actually had somebody at a show a couple years ago sort of call me out on the fact that I wasn't addressing some of the sort of awful stereotypes that came through this material and how sort of white male focused the material is. And I was sort of dealing with it in a more formal way. So like those sort of formal narrative issues were more important in that early work. And I had a fellow artist just call me out, and she's like, how can you use this stuff without sort of addressing you're sort of covering up the horrible things, you're not really addressing them. And I took that to heart, and I really thought about it. And so this work has really been an opportunity to sort of think about my own privilege as well, and how I work through that and how I recognize it. Because I have opinions about what's happening in the world. I'm concerned about social justice. I'm concerned about race issues in our country. But I'm about as privileged as it gets. Like I'm a cisgender white male from the Midwest. Like I've had it about as good as anybody can get it. So what do I have to offer? What can I talk about? And I found one of the best ways, or a way that I can sort of find a voice in this conversation is to kind of think about a white male perspective. I started collecting images of frightened men, or men that are angry, men that are upset. There's actually a lot of them, which kind of makes sense. But I started thinking about what is it that they're afraid of? Like, where does the anxiety come from? And I actually think that's a bigger conversation to have. Like, obviously, like in this instance, I think I posted it on social media. He's actually about to be trampled by an elephant foot. So obviously there was some concern there. But like, when you remove that and we just look at the fear, we just look at the anxiety, we can start to have a broader conversation about where does this fear of the other come from? Where does this hostility come from? Where does this like fear of losing preeminence come from? If we can start to talk about that, I feel like there's an opportunity to be constructive. And so these are just pieces, they take various forms, and I would say like the Arthurian piece is probably as much in this series as the other one. But just this idea of showing people in this situation, and it's like they're afraid, but what's important is that I never show anything specific for them to be afraid of. Like, I never want them to have a reason to be afraid. Working digitally, all of a sudden, like, I could get rid of a mistake by clicking on it. It was amazing. It was amazing. Like, to be able, what I decided I really needed was a way to go back and edit and change. So yeah, I mean, part of what you're describing, like, you might find something, you might draw it to put into the final composition. You're like, this is great, and then all of a sudden you realize that the light is coming from a different spot. And I'm like back in intro to painting class, right? But I can go back into Procreate and I can remove the shadows, or I can place them in another. So again, I think we were talking a little bit about, like, do they come whole cloth from the original? Not always. Like, they do sometimes have to be manipulated for very formal issues like that. You have to make them all go together. I mean, it's hard to explain all that, so I usually, if somebody asks me how I'm doing this, I just say, yeah, I take this from a comic book and I redraw it. But there is actually a lot more to it.
There's some band-aid dots over
Yeah, I do actually have to make changes, but at the same time try to hide the fact that I did it. I do try to populate these pieces with people from other races, backgrounds, when it's appropriate to do so, so that it does feel so the pieces do feel populated the way they should feel populated. Often the pieces are satirical and quite critical, and so there are times when that would not be appropriate. So for example, going back to the Arthurian piece, I did think about, like, how representative should this be, and I had to go back to sort of what is it that I'm thinking about here, and it is that sort of like the paradigm of, like, the white man is the sort of the king of his castle, like, I'm in charge. This is that dynamic, and so making that feel more representative is then me sort of attacking other people, and where I don't have agency to do that. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you for that question. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.